The wind off the Pacific was sharp that morning, carrying a smell of brine and wet driftwood along the near-empty stretch of sand. It was late October 2005, and Harold Kincaid, a retired postal worker, was walking the tide line on a small beach north of Coos Bay, Oregon. He came out here most mornings with a thermos of coffee, scanning for shells or the occasional Japanese glass float that storms sometimes coughed up. That day, at 8:42 a.m., his boot struck something small and metallic, half buried in the damp sand. He bent down. It was a gold lapel pin about the size of a nickel, its surface scratched but still gleaming in the weak sun. Across the curve of the enamel were the words, "State Bar of California." The clasp on the back was bent, as if it had been torn from a jacket. Harold had no reason to think much of it, until he noticed the corrosion. This hadn't been lying on a dresser somewhere. It had been in salt water for a long time. He slipped it into his pocket, and that afternoon mentioned it to his neighbor, a retired sheriff's deputy. 2 days later, police were at his door. They told him the pin matched one issued in the early 1980s to an attorney named Richard Mason, a man who had vanished without trace from a cruise ship 22 years earlier. Back then, in 1983, Mason was 41 years old and well known in Los Angeles legal circles. Not flashy, but successful. He'd built a reputation on high-stakes corporate litigation, the kind that made enemies and allies in equal measure. He lived with his wife, Linda, and their 2 children in a Spanish-style home in the hills above Glendale. By outward appearances, they were a picture of stability. That spring, the couple booked a week-long cruise from Los Angeles down the coast to Mexico. It was meant as an anniversary trip, though those close to them later said the marriage had been fraying for years. The night before they boarded, a neighbor overheard them arguing in the driveway. Linda's voice was sharp, Richard's low and flat. The words were indistinct, but the tone stuck in the neighbor's memory. The Pacific Star departed San Pedro under clear skies. The first day was calm, with blue water stretching to every horizon. Richard spent much of it on deck, smoking alone, watching the swells. Linda attended a wine tasting in one of the lounges. They were rarely seen together except at dinner. On the 4th night, the ship anchored off the coast of Baja. A jazz quartet played in the main lounge, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the sweet tang of rum cocktails. Witnesses later recalled seeing Richard leaning against the rail of the starboard promenade deck, speaking with a man in a pale gray suit. The conversation looked tense. One woman said the man in the suit had his hand on Richard's arm, not in greeting, but in a way that made her think of restraint. At 2:15 a.m., another passenger claimed he saw Richard again, this time alone, on the upper observation deck. The man went inside to fetch his wife, thinking they might join him to watch the stars. By the time they returned, the deck was empty. The following morning, Linda told the steward she believed her husband had gone to bed early after leaving her in the lounge. But when the steward tried to deliver breakfast to their cabin, Richard's bed was undisturbed. His suitcase was still there. His wallet and passport were in the small wall safe. By mid-morning, the ship's security team was combing through every cabin and common area. There was no sign of him. No one had seen him disembark at any port. At 11:32 a.m., the captain's voice came over the loudspeakers, his tone measured but edged with tension. "Attention, passengers. We are currently conducting a search for a missing guest. Please remain calm and follow any instructions from the crew." Within the hour, the Pacific Star slowed to a crawl. Crew members lined the rails, scanning the water for anything: debris, clothing, a body. The search spread across a growing swath of ocean. The last confirmed sighting of Richard Mason remained that moment on the upper deck, under the dim red glow of the night lights, staring out toward the black Pacific. After that, he was gone. Whether he had jumped, fallen, or been pushed was a question that would haunt everyone who knew him for decades. And on that cold Oregon beach in 2005, Harold Kincaid turned a small, corroded piece of gold over in his palm, unaware that he'd just stirred a case most people thought had been buried by time and distance. Within days, detectives were pulling the old file out of storage, and the first question they asked was one that still had no answer. How does something belonging to a man lost hundreds of miles at sea end up here 2 decades later? Just wondering, where are you watching from? Write it down, Bellow. The Pacific can turn on you fast. That night in 1983, the air had been still and almost too warm for the open sea. By dawn, low clouds had rolled in, flattening the horizon into a seamless sheet of gray. A cold wind pushed spray up from the bow. The Pacific Star cut her speed to under 10 knots as the crew began the full-scale search. Every cabin door was knocked on. Passengers were asked to check bathrooms, balconies, even storage closets. The ship's purser, a wiry man with a clipped accent, moved from deck to deck with a clipboard, marking off cleared areas. The search wasn't just for a missing man anymore. It was for anything that might explain how he could simply cease to exist between one heartbeat and the next. By 10 a.m., the news had reached every passenger. Small knots of people gathered in the lounges and dining rooms, whispering. A woman in a blue sundress told anyone who would listen that she'd seen a disturbance near the starboard rail around midnight. Others swore they'd noticed nothing unusual, except the arguing couple earlier in the evening. Members of the deck crew reported something more specific. One of them, Jorge Alvarez, said he'd been cleaning near the promenade rail at about 1:45 a.m. when he saw Richard Mason holding a white envelope in one hand, gripping the rail with the other. Alvarez had looked away for a moment, distracted by a burst of laughter from the lounge. When he turned back, both Mason and the envelope were gone. Another steward recalled Linda Mason's reaction when security arrived at her cabin. She'd stood in the doorway, blocking them, insisting there was no need to search. Only when the ship's officer reminded her it was procedure did she step aside. Even then, she kept her eyes on a single leather suitcase near the foot of the bed, and when the steward bent toward it, she told him sharply that its contents were personal. The captain, a 27-year veteran of cruise lines, knew how quickly rumor could sour a voyage. By midday, he'd been approached by the company's shore office, urging a measured response to avoid alarming other passengers. There was talk of treating the disappearance as a possible suicide or accident, an unfortunate but private matter. The captain pushed back. Protocol required a full man-overboard search, and his officers had already begun sweeping the ocean in a widening circle. The mood aboard shifted. Some passengers offered to help, scouring open decks with binoculars. Others stayed in their cabins, irritated by the delays and the fact that the pool deck had been closed. The casino remained open, though a quiet tension hummed through it. Even the dealers seemed distracted. By late afternoon, a helicopter from the Mexican Navy had joined the search, skimming low over the swells, its rotor wash flattening the whitecaps. The Pacific Star maintained position, engines idling. Crew members leaned over the rails, eyes darting across the water. Every flicker of foam or shadow beneath the surface could be him, or nothing. Hours passed. The cold settled in. The hope of finding Richard alive thinned with every minute. The captain made another announcement at 6:20 p.m., his voice softer this time. We regret to inform you that despite extensive search efforts, we have found no sign of our missing guest. We will resume course shortly. No applause of relief, no collective sigh, just a heavy quiet that clung to the corridors. When the ship docked back in Los Angeles 3 days later, Linda Mason walked down the gangway alone, flanked by 2 officers from the cruise line. She wore a black scarf despite the mild weather, her sunglasses hiding her eyes. Reporters shouted questions about her husband, about what she'd seen, but she didn't turn her head. She stepped into a waiting town car, and the door closed behind her. For the official record, the case was filed under Missing at Sea, Presumed Dead. No body recovered. No clear witness to foul play. No evidence strong enough to pursue criminal charges. The Pacific Star sailed again 2 days later, her cabin scrubbed, her decks polished, as though nothing had happened. But for those who'd been on board that week, one detail lingered. The image of Richard Mason standing alone against the night. One hand gripping the rail, the other holding something he never let go of. Until he vanished. For most people, the story of Richard Mason ended the moment the Pacific Star turned her bow back toward Los Angeles. But for his family, the day the ship docked was the day the real wait began. In the weeks after his disappearance, the local news covered it briefly. A photo of Richard from his firm's website, a grainy shot of the cruise liner at sea, and a few lines about a tragic accident. By Christmas, the papers had moved on. There was no funeral. Linda insisted it was premature, without a body. Instead, she held a small gathering at the house, serving wine and canapés in a living room where Richard's leather briefcase still sat beside his desk. Their son, Mark, was 19 then, home from his first semester at UC Santa Barbara. He remembered walking into his father's study late that night, the party long over. Linda had gone upstairs. The desk lamp was still on, casting a pool of light over the blotter. A single yellow legal pad lay there, a few pages torn off. Mark sat down, ran his hand over the cool leather of the chair, and for the first time felt the odd, hollow shape of absence. In the years that followed, Linda sold the house and moved to a condo in Pasadena. She rarely spoke of Richard, except in the vaguest terms. When pressed, she would say she accepted that he was gone. But Mark never accepted it. The fact that there had been no body, no wreckage, no trace except rumor, it gnawed at him. By the mid-1990s, he'd turned the study in his small apartment into an archive of the case. Manila folders filled with cruise ship logs, passenger lists, and photocopies of handwritten witness statements lined the shelves. There were photocopied news clippings from every port call of the Pacific Star that year, most of them yellowing now. He cold-called former passengers, tracking down anyone who'd been on the ship that week. Most declined to talk. A few remembered flashes, Richard in the casino, Richard reading a paperback on deck, but nothing conclusive. Then, in 1996, Mark found something that didn't fit. A friend who worked in banking traced a wire transfer from Richard's account to a numbered account in Panama, just 6 days before the cruise departed. The sum was large enough to raise questions, but the transfer had been routed through an intermediary service, making it nearly impossible to track the recipient. Mark didn't know what disturbed him more, the idea that his father might have been hiding money, or the possibility that he'd been planning to disappear all along. It was around then that he got a call from a man who identified himself only as a former passenger. The voice was gravelly, older, but certain. He told Mark he had been walking on deck 8 in the early hours of the morning when he saw 2 men near the rail. One was in a dark suit, the other in what he remembered as a pale jacket. The man in the dark suit had been lifting something, maybe a bundle, over the side. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, assuming it was trash. Only later, when he heard about the missing lawyer, did the image return, sharper than before. Whatever it was, the man said, it was heavy, and whoever was with him didn't want to be seen. Mark asked if he could meet him in person, but the man refused. "I shouldn't have called," he said, before hanging up. By 2003, 2 decades had passed. The case file, what little there was of it, sat in a cabinet at the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office. The official position hadn't changed. Accident or suicide. But Mark kept pushing. He wrote letters to the cruise line, to the state bar, even to maritime investigators in Mexico. The answers, when they came, were polite but empty. Then, in October 2005, the phone rang. It was a detective from Coos County, Oregon. They'd found something on a beach, he said. A gold lapel pin issued to members of the California State Bar. The engraving on the back matched Richard's membership number exactly. The pin was corroded but intact. Barnacles scarring along the edges suggested it had spent years in salt water before washing ashore. But the beach where it had been found was hundreds of miles north of where the Pacific Star had been when Richard vanished. Ocean currents could carry debris far. Yes, but over 22 years? Mark drove up to see it himself. The detective laid it out on a piece of black felt. Mark didn't touch it. He just stared, as if the pin might somehow answer all the questions it had just created. How had it survived? Why now? And most of all, was it possible that it had been planted? The file was reopened, and with it, every suspicion, every half-forgotten rumor came flooding back. If this story touched you, even a little, let me know in the comments. We read them all. They reopened the file with the awkwardness of people touching an old wound. The case number was the same, but the faces around the table were new. Younger detectives, fresh badges, a lieutenant who'd been a patrol officer back when the Pacific Star turned around. Boxes came up from storage, their tape brittle, their contents smelling faintly of toner and mildew. The pin from Oregon sat in a clear acrylic box at the center of the conference table, like a relic. The State Crime Lab didn't start with romance. They started with microscopes and salts. Under magnification, the enamel showed hairline scratches from sand, but the gold plating hadn't pitted the way 22 years in the Pacific should have forced it to. There were no barnacle bases cemented to the metal, no calcium rings that suggested long submersion. The clasp, bent at a clean angle, still opened and closed with a soft click. The report's phrasing was careful. Condition inconsistent, with continuous exposure to marine environment. Translation: whatever journey it had taken to that beach, most of it hadn't been underwater. That contradiction changed the temperature in the room. A thing from the past had appeared in the present with too little damage to explain the time between. Either the ocean had stopped being itself, or someone had delivered the pin to the tide line recently, expecting it to be found. Mark Mason didn't wait on the next memo. He rented a car and drove north until the map turned green and wet. The address he had for the former passenger, one of the last names on a list he'd been building since the 90s, led to a single-story house tucked deep among second-growth fir on the Washington coast. It was late afternoon when he pulled up. The road had given way to moss and potholes, and the air smelled like cedar bark and rain. The man who opened the door had a fisherman's hands and a smoker's cough. He watched Mark through the screen for a full 10 seconds before unhooking the latch. "I was there," he said, before Mark could finish the sentence. "I remember what I remember." They sat at a table scarred by coffee cups and knife nicks. Light seeped in through a narrow window. When the man spoke, his voice was steady, not theatrical. "I heard a shout," he said. "Not a slip, not a laugh that got out of hand. A man's voice. It came from up by the rail. I ran out. Nothing. Just water and dark. Whoever yelled wasn't there anymore." He rubbed his jaw with the back of his hand. "I told the purser the next day. He thanked me like I'd handed him a napkin." Can you say what time? Mark asked. A little after 2, the man said. I remember because the lounge clock was stuck at 2:03. Been stuck for months, they said. It spooked my wife. Did you see anyone else? A man in a suit the color of a dirty cloud, he said after a beat. I don't know if I really saw him then, or if I put him there after they started asking about suits. Memory's a liar that tries to help. Mark left with the smell of damp wood in his clothes and the shape of that stuck clock in his head. If there had been a scream, it complicated everything and nothing at once. It held no proof you could take to court. It wouldn't tell a lab what Salt had or hadn't done to a gold pin. Back in Los Angeles, the detectives tried for Linda again. The condo door chain stayed latched while she spoke. She was polite at first. There was a pot of something simmering, garlic heavy in the air, but her voice took on the tone Mark remembered from childhood whenever anyone pushed. I have nothing new to say, she told the sergeant. 30 minutes after you leave, I'll still have nothing new to say. My husband is gone. I live with that. The door clicked shut on the last word. It was not slammed. It was placed. In the squad room, theories began to rearrange themselves. With the pin's condition questionable, the envelope that a crewman remembered in Richard's hand mattered more. So did the transfer to Panama. So did the man in the gray suit, threaded through multiple accounts like a rumor that refused to dissipate. The word staged came out of someone's mouth for the first time without being laughed back in. If it had been staged, the staging had resources behind it and patience to burn. The more they asked, the foggier things became. A deckhand who'd talked in '83 now claimed no memory of Richard at all. A waitress who had sworn she saw a couple arguing admitted she might have been mixing trips. The jazz lounge looked the same on every ship. Time does that. It sands edges down until everything fits everywhere. Meanwhile, the phone calls started coming to Mark again. Some were cranks, people who liked attaching themselves to other people's grief. One, from a woman in San Diego, swore she'd seen his father at a marina in 1987, wearing a cap and a beard. She hung up when he asked for a photo. Another caller claimed to be writing a book and asked for copies of bank statements. Mark didn't sleep much. He went back over his father's last months, the syntax of his texts, the gaps in his calendar. He tried to imagine his father the planner and his father the victim, and neither felt like the whole truth. A detective from Financial Crimes briefed the team on what they could pull so far. Offshore accounts are not caves, but labyrinths. You can walk a long time and end up where you started thinking you've traveled far. Still, the Panamanian wire wasn't a ghost. It showed up in the bank's audit trail, clean and deliberate. If the account was still active, as rumor and a thin lead suggested, then someone had been gardening the past, keeping it alive. The lieutenant asked out loud what others had been thinking. If this was an exit, who opened the door? And if it wasn't, who keeps dragging it back into view? The whiteboard collected lines that didn't meet. The pin, the scream, the wife who had no more words, the suit, the color of a dirty cloud. On a Tuesday night, after a day spent failing to move any of those lines closer, Mark sat in his car in the parking lot behind his apartment, listening to the radio static between stations. The streetlights hummed. A moth pinged the windshield. His phone lit his face pale. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. He did. At first there was only breathing. Not heavy, not disguised. Human. Then a male voice. Midwestern, maybe. Trained flat. Your father didn't drown. Mark didn't speak. The voice left a space for him and filled it itself. You can keep digging, the man said. You might even get there. But you won't like where there is. You might regret it. A soft click. The old-fashioned kind that tells you a line has ended on purpose." The screen returned to dark. The night around him felt too large and too small at once. He sat there until the moth found another light. Somewhere that week, a lab tech wrote a second addendum about the pin's lack of salt crystallization in the hinge. Somewhere else, an old man in Washington wiped fog from a window and pretended the clock on his wall didn't stick at 2:03. In Pasadena, Linda turned down the stove and set 2 plates on the counter for 1 person. And a new fact, spoken like a threat and a mercy in the same breath, began to change how Mark measured risk. The Panamanian lead didn't start as a thread you could pull. It was more like a seam you noticed only when the light hit it at a certain angle. A junior investigator in financial crimes found it in a folder of scanned telex receipts. Richard Mason's name on a transfer order dated exactly 6 days before the Pacific Star sailed. $85,000, wired to an account number in Panama City, with a beneficiary name that didn't match any known associate. The bank logs, what little was accessible under U.S. jurisdiction, showed no closure. If anything, the account had been active far longer than anyone expected. Transactions logged as late as 2001. The money trail suggested continuity. Someone was keeping it alive. That was enough to send one detective into the archives for crew manifests. 2 names jumped out: a steward who'd worked only a single voyage in '83, and a lounge pianist who'd stayed on the ship for 2 more seasons before disappearing from employment records. Neither was reachable. But then, in a motel outside San Pedro, a retired deckhand agreed to meet. He was in his 70s now, but his recall of ship layout was surgical. He traced the service corridors with a fingertip on a coffee-stained napkin. "That night," he said, "I saw your dad. Not on a passenger deck. He was in the crew service passage, heading aft. That was off-limits to guests. He was walking with another man. Tall, dark suit, not uniform. They weren't running, but they were moving like the space behind them was getting smaller." "Did he look distressed?" Mark asked. The old man's eyes narrowed. "He looked like someone who'd made a decision." That image stuck. Richard moving deeper into a part of the ship where passengers didn't belong, guided by someone who wasn't supposed to be there either. Weeks later, the beach in Oregon gave up a second offering. A parks worker combing driftwood for removal found a fragment of weathered leather tangled in kelp. It was the side panel of an old suitcase, the stitching rotted through in places. Where a luggage tag should have been, the leather was neatly cut away, as if to remove an identifying name. The Parks Department sent it to the police because of the pin's proximity on the map, but there was no way to prove it had ever belonged to Richard. At the same time, the investigation into the Panamanian account ran headlong into the kind of banking secrecy that doesn't just refuse to answer, but makes you aware you've asked the wrong kind of question. Formal requests were met with formal refusals. Behind closed doors, an analyst told the lead detective that someone with an American passport had accessed the account as recently as 4 years earlier. No names, no images, just a date and a note that the person had left the bank with a small parcel. It was becoming harder to hold on to the picture of Richard as a man who had simply fallen overboard or been pushed in a moment of violence. The financial trail, the closed-door corridors, the absence of decay on the pin, all of it leaned toward a scenario in which he had chosen to step off the grid, or had been helped to do so. Then the email arrived. It came to the generic tip line, sent from an address created hours earlier and accessed through an anonymizing service. Attached was a single JPEG. The metadata was stripped, but the resolution was grainy in a way that suggested film scanned in the late 90s. The image showed a busy waterfront, small fishing boats moored to weathered pilings, gulls in mid-flight. In the background, half turned toward the camera, was a man in a linen shirt, his hair longer and flecked with gray, a beard masking his jawline. He was carrying a duffel over one shoulder. The face was older, but the eyes and brow line were Richard Mason's. On the edge of the frame, a painted sign in Spanish gave away little except that the port was in the tropics. No date, no location, just enough clarity to spark recognition, and just enough ambiguity to feed doubt. The detective printed it, pinned it beside the photograph from Richard's State Bar file. Under the fluorescent lights, the similarities were unnerving. The ears, the slope of the shoulders, the posture of a man used to scanning a crowd without looking like he was scanning. Mark stared at the two images until the rest of the room went quiet around him. If the photograph was real, it placed his father alive 14 years after the night the Pacific Star slowed to circle an empty patch of water. Alive and somewhere warm, far from Los Angeles courtrooms and mortgages and the version of himself he'd left on the passenger manifest. But if it was fake, and in 2005, fakes could be made well enough to mislead, then someone was investing time and skill into manufacturing a ghost. The question was why? That night, lying awake with the printout on the nightstand, Mark replayed the deckhand's words. He looked like someone who'd made a decision. It was easier to imagine a shove than a choice, but the Panamanian account, the missing luggage tag, and now this photograph suggested otherwise. Somewhere between those two pictures, a man on a cruise ship in 1983 and a man on a dock in 1997, was the truth. The problem was, every step toward it felt like a step onto ground that might not hold. Mark booked the ticket to Panama without telling the police. He didn't trust them to move quickly, or to tell him if they found something first. The airport air was heavy with humidity the moment he stepped off the plane, a wall of heat and salt that clung to his clothes. The bank was a stone-fronted colonial building in the older part of Panama City, the kind of place that looked more like a church than a financial institution. Inside, everything smelled faintly of paper and wax polish. Mark presented the account number to a polite woman in a navy suit. She didn't even check her screen before shaking her head. "Confidential," she said. "Only the account holder or designated party may view." "I'm his son," Mark said, sliding over a copy of his birth certificate. Her eyes stayed flat. "That is not a designation." As she turned the papers back toward him, Mark caught something in her glance, an involuntary flick toward the far end of the marble hall. He followed it. A man in his 60s, light-skinned, wearing a pale Panama hat and dark glasses, stood by the exit, his posture too still for a casual customer. The man's jaw tightened when their eyes met, and he stepped outside. Mark moved toward the door, but by the time he pushed it open, the man was gone, swallowed by the churn of traffic and street vendors. Back at the hotel, his phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. A gruff voice said only, "He was here 3 months ago. Used a U.S. passport. You're late." Then the line went dead. The information fit too neatly with what the detective had been told off the record. Someone with an American passport accessing the account, leaving with a parcel. The voice hadn't said Richard's name, but it didn't have to. When Mark got home, he went looking for any remaining threads. One came from an unexpected place. In a box of his mother's things, stored since her death, he found a card from a man named Calder. The name triggered a memory. Calder had been a private investigator his father's firm occasionally used in the early 80s. A long shot, but Mark dialed the number. Against all odds, Calder answered. Older now, his voice rasped with age and cigarettes. "I wondered when you'd call," he said. "Your father told me to keep something, in case his kids ever came looking." 2 days later, Mark sat across from him in a one-bedroom apartment that smelled of dust and old coffee. Calder pulled a cassette tape from a locked metal box. "This came to me 6 months after he disappeared. No return address, no note." They found an old player. The tape hissed for a moment, then a man's voice, low and strained. "I can't come back. Tell the kids it's for their good. I had no choice." The sound punched through the years. It wasn't just the words, it was the way his father breathed between them, the same deliberate rhythm Mark remembered from late-night talks when he was a boy. "Why didn't you tell us?" Mark asked. "Because I didn't know if it would help you or bury you," Calder said. "Sometimes knowing is worse." Meanwhile, the police were quietly running their own tests on the state bar pin and the suitcase fragment. The metallurgical report was odd. The pin surface wear matched 5 to 10 years of environmental exposure, not 22. The leather fragment showed clean knife cuts where the tag had been removed, edges too sharp to have been worn away by sea or sand. It was beginning to look deliberate, staged, as if someone wanted the investigation reopened, on their schedule. That night, back at his apartment, Mark found a manila envelope propped against his door. No return address. Inside, a single brass key wrapped in tissue paper and a folded sheet of printer paper. The note contained just one word, in block letters: "Not alone." Below it, in smaller print, a number, a box at a storage facility in San Francisco. He sat on the couch with the key in his palm, feeling its weight. Every lead so far had split into two paths, one toward a man alive in the shadows, the other toward the possibility of a carefully constructed myth. This one felt different. It wasn't just an object. It was an invitation. But from who and for what was a question he couldn't answer without opening the box. The key was heavier in his pocket than it should have been. By the time Mark reached San Francisco, he'd run his thumb over the stamped numbers so many times they were practically memorized. The bank was an old, granite-fronted structure downtown, with brass fittings worn smooth by decades of use. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of coin and dust. The clerk examined the key, cross-checked a number, and led him through a narrow hallway to a row of safety deposit boxes. Her shoes clicked on the tile in a rhythm that reminded him of courtroom floors. "You'll have privacy," she said, sliding the narrow metal drawer onto a table in a small booth. Then she left, closing the door behind her. Mark hesitated. He'd spent months chasing fragments, a photograph here, a rumor there, none of them tangible. This was different. The box had weight. The latch clicked open with a sound that made his chest tighten. Inside, stacked neatly as if waiting for an owner who never came back, were a dozen black-and-white photographs. Some were stiff with age, curling at the edges. In most, his father looked younger than Mark remembered, grinning in a fishing boat, standing in front of a nondescript motel, leaning against a sedan with the license plate deliberately obscured. One photo stopped him cold. His father, unmistakably, but wearing a beard and a pair of dark aviator glasses, standing in what looked like a marketplace crowded with signs in Spanish. The year scrawled on the back was 1986, 3 years after he'd vanished. Beneath the photos lay a United States passport. The name on the front read David L. Harper. The photo was Richard Mason. Mark flipped through the pages. Stamps from Panama, Belize, Curaçao. The last one, Honduras, 1992. After that, nothing. Under the passport was a thick manila envelope. He peeled it open and found stacks of crisp bills, hundreds, 50s, all dated between 1981 and 1983. The smell of old paper and ink rose up sharply, a scent like safety and danger mixed together. He ran his thumb over the top bill. The paper felt rougher than modern currency. At the bottom of the box, folded twice, was a letter written in his father's tight, slanted hand. "Mark," it began, "if you're reading this, it means you've gotten further than I ever wanted you to. There are people who do not forgive. In 1983, I was handling a case that exposed corruption at levels you don't imagine exist in this country. Judges, prosecutors, names you'd recognize, tied to money that wasn't theirs, and deaths they pretended not to see. When I took the retainer, I thought it was just another defense. It wasn't. It was a warning shot." The next lines described a man on the ship. No name, only that he wore the kind of suit you don't sweat in, even in the tropics, and that he was there for one reason: to make sure Richard didn't come home. I didn't jump. I was removed. Mark's eyes ran down the page until the words simply stopped mid-sentence, the pen trailing off. The last page was missing. The booth felt smaller suddenly, the air too still. He put the items back carefully, but the absence of that final page was a hole he could feel in his chest. If someone had taken it, they'd been here after the box was first locked, and that meant they had the same key or the bank's cooperation. Walking out into the late afternoon fog of San Francisco, Mark couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on him. At first, it was just a shadow across the street, the impression of a parked car where there hadn't been one before. But when he turned down Market, the dark sedan eased away from the curb and followed, 2 cars back. He tried to convince himself it was coincidence. City traffic was like that. But every time he changed lanes, it changed too. The windows were tinted black. He couldn't see the driver. By the time he reached the freeway south, the sedan was still there, unhurried, never closer than it needed to be. It followed him all the way to the outskirts, until the road narrowed and the sky turned the color of lead. In his mirror, the car's headlights blinked once, then twice, as if signaling. Then, without warning, it turned off onto a side road and disappeared behind a line of trees. Mark drove the rest of the way home with his hands tight on the wheel, the taste of metal in his mouth, and the box's contents replaying in his head. The photos, the passport, the money, and a letter that told him his father had been hunted, without telling him why the hunt might not be over. The sedan's absence didn't feel like safety. It felt like a pause. He crossed into Mexico with a backpack, and the kind of itinerary you don't write down. The tip Nora passed him was Thin, an alias, a town near the coast. A rumor that a former security officer from the Pacific Star had been living there for years under a new name. Mark rented a room above a pharmacy where the air smelled of eucalyptus and bleach, then spent 2 days walking the same 5 blocks at different hours until the faces sorted themselves into familiar and not. The man he was looking for showed up at dusk, buying cigarettes from a kiosk and counting out coins too slowly for a local. He had the posture of someone who had learned to keep his back toward walls. When Mark said the name he'd been given, the man's eyes didn't move. When Mark said, "Security officer," they did. They met in a courtyard behind a closed cafe. Metal chairs scraped quiet across tile. A gecko clung to the wall above them like a punctuation mark holding its breath. The man's hands shook just enough to make a cigarette look heavier than it was. "You don't say my real name," he said. "Not here. Not anywhere." "I need what you remember," Mark said. "What I remember doesn't help you sleep," the man replied. He watched the street through the filigree of a wrought iron gate. "Your father was given a choice." He said the word choice like it tasted bad. "Disappear," he said, "or be found." "Found where?" Mark asked, though he knew. "In the water, with a story attached." The cigarette burned down. He tapped ash into a terracotta pot with dead soil. "We were told to keep our eyes on the passenger decks, so I walked the service corridors. Saw him in the aft crew passage, 1 level below where he belonged, with 2 men I didn't know. Not officers, not crew. Suits even at that hour, like the night didn't touch them. Did he see you? He looked right at me and then looked through me. A muscle jumped in the man's cheek. We had a sign for trouble. Hand on the shoulder, 2 squeezes. I did it to my partner. He did nothing. That's when I knew it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an instruction. What happened after? Mark asked. An hour? Less. I heard engines where there shouldn't be engines. He dragged smoke and let it out in a thin line. Went up to the boat deck. They'd lowered one of the service tenders. No announcement, no lights. It skimmed out into the dark with 3 figures in it. Your father was one. I watched until the sound was gone. Why didn't you report it? Mark heard how accusatory the question sounded and didn't pull it back. The man laughed once, without humor. To who? The captain who was told the next morning we'd had an accident. The company that bought its truth wholesale? I filed a note no one read. That night, a man in a suit told me my contract was over. My ID stopped opening doors. I was off the ship before noon. My pension disappeared like it had never existed. He ground the cigarette out and lit another. I left the country the next month. I like my heart beating. You understand? Mark did. He didn't say it. Your father wasn't the first passenger who needed to become no one, the man added. He was the first who looked like he understood it was safer than the alternative. When Mark asked for names, the man shook his head. You live longer when you keep nouns out of your mouth. The conversation ended the way it had started, without a handshake. Mark walked back through streets that pretended to be empty and weren't, feeling eyes in the gaps between buildings. He slept badly, if at all. Sometime near dawn, the front desk called to say there was a package for him. It was wrapped in brown paper and bound with twine, as if haste and caution had been asked to share a job. No sender. Inside, a stack of photocopies, dog-eared and underlined. An old case file from Richard's practice, one Mark had never seen. The caption at the top was innocuous, a corporate dispute. The annotations were not. Names of judges, assistant district attorneys, and a city official circled in red, several marked with crosses and dates. Mark recognized some from headlines he hadn't connected at the time. A judge who died in a one-car accident on a dry road. A prosecutor found at home. No foul play suspected. A deputy city attorney gone in a medical event weeks before a deposition. On the last page, next to the name of a senior prosecutor, someone had written, "He knows about the ships." He stared at the words until they blurred. He left Mexico on a midday flight that felt too bright for the weight in his bag. In the airport, a woman with a child stared at him over a magazine, then looked away when he looked back. He didn't know if she was watching him or watching the space around him, and it didn't matter. He was done assuming coincidence. Back in the U.S., the evening heat sat over his street like a lid. He knew something was wrong before he reached the door. The porch light, which he left on a timer, wasn't on. The lock turned the way it always did, but the door moved differently. Looser, as if someone had taught it a new trick. Inside, the air had a disturbed smell, rubber soles on carpet, a draft that shouldn't be there. Nothing was overturned. The TV sat where it belonged. Books on the shelf made their neat, lying rows. It took him 5 seconds to cross the living room and 10 to open the hall closet where he kept a small fire safe behind a stack of board games nobody played. The safe door hung open a 1/4 inch. He'd set the combination himself. Only he and Nora knew it. No pry marks, no scratches on the dial. The interior was empty. The photocopies from the San Francisco box, gone. The notes he'd taken on the Panamanian account, gone. The cassette Calder had made him swear to guard. Gone. A thin line of dust on the safe's lip had 2 finger marks where someone steadied it. The prints would be partial and useless. He knew that before he reached for the phone. He sat on the floor with his back to the wall until his knees stopped telling on him. When he called Nora, he kept his voice level because he didn't want to hear it break. "Don't stay there tonight," she said. "I'll send someone to dust, but they won't find what we need." "Who has a key?" he asked, though he knew that wasn't how this worked. "People who don't need keys," she said. He left the house with one bag and the feeling of being followed by his own door. The motel room he paid cash for was loud with highway noise and smelled like a bottle of cleaner that had given up. He set the chair under the knob anyway. He put his phone face down on the nightstand and watched the shadow of the curtain move against the wall. The photocopies from Mexico lay spread on the bedspread like a deal gone bad. He studied the underlined names until patterns emerged he wished didn't. The dates formed an arc. The crosses came after depositions were scheduled. In the margins, a hand, his father's, had written in a slanted rush, "Not an accident, not random, not done." He pictured the motor launch cutting a seam through black water, the way the engines would sound small at a distance, the way a man might decide to become someone else rather than become a headline someone else would write. He pictured the officer in Mexico lighting a cigarette and refusing the comfort of names. He pictured the safe at home, open like a mouth. At 3 a.m., a car idled in the lot outside long enough to be a message. When he peered through the curtain, all he saw was tail lights, red coins fading. By morning, an email sat in his inbox from an address that had lived for all of 7 minutes. No greeting. A single line. "Stop chasing ghosts you plan to meet." He didn't reply. He took a shower hot enough to raise the smell of chlorine from the cheap towels and scrubbed until his skin felt like something he could still own. He drove back to the house when the sun was high and unkind, met the technician dusting powder onto a surface that didn't want to hold it, and signed a form that would file itself with others like it. Nothing was missing, the report would say, except the things that had mattered. He told himself, again, that the sedan on the corner was not the same one from San Francisco, that sedans came in black by the thousands, and that paranoia is a production line that never sleeps. He told himself a lot of things. He kept the box key in his jeans pocket anyway. In the quiet that followed, the world arranged itself to look unchanged. The dishwasher cycled. A neighbor's dog barked at a mail carrier. Somewhere behind all that domestic noise, something larger kept count. The file from Mexico sat in his bag, anchor-heavy, with its underlined names and its suggestion that the ocean was just one of the places truth goes to be made tidy. He made coffee he didn't drink and stared out the window at nothing. He could feel the story trying to end itself in a way he could sign for. He could feel something else refusing. When the phone rang, he jumped hard enough to shame himself. The number was one he didn't know, from a state he hadn't been to. He let it go to voicemail. The message was 7 seconds of quiet. He pressed play twice to be sure. Someone was breathing. Then, very softly, a door latched. Weeks bled into each other after the break-in. Mark learned the sounds of his house, the way you learn a language under threat. The soft click the thermostat makes at 2 a.m. The particular complaint of the porch step in damp weather. How the refrigerator hum shifts a half tone right before the ice maker drops. He changed his routes, parked on different blocks, kept the radio off so the silence could tell him if it had company. Nothing obvious happened, which was its own kind of message. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, wedged between a realtor flyer and a municipal notice about tree trimming. No return address. International stamps clustered like a rash across the upper right corner, postmarked somewhere in the EU. The paper was heavier than local mail, with a texture you feel before you think to name it. He carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table. Sunlight came across the counter in a blade, catching dust he didn't remember seeing before the break-in. He locked the door out of reflex and moved the chair so his back wasn't to the window. The edge of the envelope parted under his thumb with a dry whisper. Inside, a small wrapped parcel, and beneath it, a photograph. Real paper, not an inkjet print, the kind of glossy you can't buy in drugstores anymore. The image had that old film tone, color trimmed of its neon, shadows with the blues pulled out. A cafe somewhere that wasn't here. Tables on a sidewalk, metal chairs with worn paint at the edges. A late spring sky, pale and weak. Cyrillic letters on a sign behind the glass. In the foreground, an older man sat with a newspaper folded to the crossword. A porcelain cup in front of him, with a ring of coffee brown on the saucer. His beard was white at the chin, and yellow along the mustache, the way nicotine does when you live with it. The eyes, though. The shape of the brow. The set of the mouth when he wasn't speaking. It knocked the breath out of Mark in a way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with recognition. On the back, in blue ballpoint, a single line, May 2004. He stared until the edges of the photo vibrated, 2 years before the state bar pin surfaced in Oregon. A decade after the last passport stamp, he turned it over again and found, at the corner, a faint manufacturer mark, a brand of photo paper common in Eastern Europe in the early 2000s. Someone wanted him to notice that, or didn't care if he did. He unwrapped the smaller parcel last, tissue paper folded with exactness, tape cut cleanly, not torn. Inside lay a second lapel pin, the same size and make as the one pulled from the Oregon beach, but this one was pristine. No pitting, no sand abrasion. On the back, where the membership number would go, were 3 engraved letters, MM. He had to sit. The chair legs grated the tile and he let them. The metal felt cool in his palm, heavier than it should. The engraving was recent, the cut edges bright, the grooves free of grime. Whoever sent this hadn't found an old pin with his initials by coincidence. They'd made it for him. The note was short, printed in block letters that leaned forward like a runner. You know enough. Don't look further. This is the last warning. No signature, no flourish. The handwriting had the flat personality of someone who refused to give anything to analysis. He laid the 3 things beside one another, the photo, the pin, the note, and felt the room shrink until it fit around them, and nothing else. He thought of his father in that cafe, not smiling, not hiding, just occupying a chair like a man who had learned how to be unremarkable while being watched. He thought of the cashier in Panama, whose eyes had flicked, uninvited, to the exit. He thought of the officer in Mexico talking about choice like it had an expiration date. If Richard had lived at least into 2004, then a lot of people had chosen a lot of silences. Some of those people were still making choices for Mark. He put the photo back in the envelope, then took it out again. He couldn't stand not to see it, and he couldn't stand to look. The pin stayed in his hand. The metal warmed. He called Nora. She answered on the second ring, and he heard road noise behind her. "Don't keep that in the house," she said, when he described the contents. "I already made that mistake," he said. "You're not just on a list anymore," she said. "This is contact." "From who?" he asked, and she didn't pretend to know. That night, he drove. Nowhere necessary. He just needed the motion and the privacy of a car's little world. The freeways around midnight have their own population. Night shift trucks, the insomniacs, the couples who talk only in the dark. He looped slowly across town, then out toward the edge where the lights thin and the air turns to open. He stopped in a grocery store lot that was too bright for midnight. The asphalt still held the day's heat. It came up through the soles of his shoes when he stepped out to breathe. He got back in and locked the doors. He placed the new pin on the dash where the streetlight could burn a clean circle around it. The phone buzzed once. Unknown. He didn't answer. The voicemail icon appeared without a number to call back. He listened. 7 seconds of wind and a sound like fabric moving past a microphone. No voice. He started the car and turned off the lights. In the rearview mirror, the glass cut the world into a rectangle that didn't care about context. The row of carts. The burned-out bulb over the return bay. The black sedan. Same make as before. Same indifferent stance, 3 spaces back and 1 over, where a security camera would be blind. He told himself it could be another black sedan, 1 of 1,000, and knew he was lying to keep his heart from sprinting. He watched. It watched back by virtue of existing. His breath fogged the mirror a little. He wiped it with the heel of his hand, and in that brief smear, he saw his father's face in the cafe window instead of his own. The brain does cruel favors. He put the car in drive, then back in park. Let them make the first move, he told himself. Let someone else declare the next rule. The radio muttered static, and he twisted it off. The only sound was the thin whir of the cabin fan and the intermittent soft clicks of the cooling engine. He picked up the pin and closed his fist around it. The edges bit, not enough to break skin, just enough to remind him where his hand ended. The weight felt declarative. Headlights washed across the lot as another car entered, swung across his hood, left. The sedan stayed put. He counted the seconds off, the way you count when you're holding your breath underwater. Truths returning in stages. The man in the gray suit. The service tender carved through black water without lights. The broken link of a letter missing its last page. The photo dated May 2004. The note that said he knew enough. And the engraving on the back of a pin that suggested someone else had been writing his initials into this story long before he recognized the shape. The sedan's lights came on without the engine note changing. A faint flare of red as the brake released. It rolled forward 1 space and stopped. No hurry. No message, except that messages didn't need adjectives. He lifted the pin to the mirror, holding the 2 circles of gold together, his father's past and his present, and in the small, bright overlap, he could almost make out the outline of a life he'd never be allowed to live with. The mirror filled with black glass and the dull shine of a grill growing larger by inches. In some version of this, he guns the engine and flees. In this one, he kept still, pulse loud in his ears, because sometimes not moving is the only way to see who moves first. The sedan crept forward another foot, just enough to take up more of the frame. Mark's fingers tightened. The metal dug in. The air seemed to thin on cue. The sound cut there.